Please rewind this cassette.
Happy Halloween, motherfuckers. We're going to be talking about It Chapter 2 from the great filmmaker Andy Muschietti. Now, I've seen his first film, Mama, and it wasn't very good. And I've seen this movie now, and it also wasn't very good. So I don't really get the hype with this guy. His one film that he made that was halfway decent yet still overrated was It Chapter 1. And I think people forget how much involvement Cary Fukunaga had with that film and other people. He still got a writing credit. I think his imprint is on that film more than the producers would like to admit. Because when I look at this filmmaker's other movies and how sloppy they are, but yet there was a coherence with that. Now you could argue that it's because the storyline with the children is easier to adapt. It's what most people like in the original miniseries. It's what most people like about the book. I think that's a fair point, but that doesn't mean you couldn't make a streamlined Hollywood movie out of the adult version of the story. This film suffers from a few things. One, it's too loyal of an adaptation of the book. They keep too much stuff from the book. That if you're going to do this, this has to be a miniseries. The whole time I was watching this movie, all I was thinking to myself was, this is like 10 hours worth of story crammed into a 3-hour movie. So much happens in this goddamn movie. There's so many scenes in this movie. There's so many quick transitions. So the movie never builds a flow. The movie never builds a nice pace or a flow. Things don't feel smooth. Things don't go well. It never has a good sense of build up to lead up to scenes happening, especially the scares. The first movie had a good amount of build up, and Pennywise was in it just the right amount. And you did get to know the kids, and you got to spend time with the kids. I felt like I never got to know any of these characters in their adult versions, even though I liked all of the actors. I really thought, in particular, like Bill Hader and James Ransom, who played Eddie, and the Old Spice guy playing Mike. I think they all did terrific work. I really think it was like good acting. Like they all gave really quality performances throughout. Richie was actually really funny in this. But the movie itself is just a fucking mess, and Pennywise is awful in this movie. It's never scary. There's maybe 2 sequences that are sort of scary. It's not as good looking as the first one from a cinematography standpoint, which is, I think, has a lot to do with the cinematographer of the first film is world class. It's a lot of things here. It didn't have quite as many shitty jump scares and music cues as I was expecting. But it was a rinse and repeat thing. It's like you get to a sequence, you know it's going to be a horror sequence. It's a lot of weird shit happening, like the scene with the old lady, and then you get like a jump scare with some special effect. It worked in the first movie. I remember the scene with the projector. I remember the scene at the beginning with Georgie. I remember a few sequences being, pretty creepy. And I remember Pennywise just being creepy. Pennywise is at his best when he's just talking. And for some reason, they don't realize this, and they keep spending money on special effects when they just need to have Pennywise talking. One of the creepiest scenes in this movie is one with a little girl that has like a birthmark on her face, some kind of scar. And she talks to Pennywise under the bleachers at, I guess, a football game or something, and he's just there talking to her. And there's no special effects to it, really. And then you let Bill Skarsgård actually like do what he does. He's a really good actor. And that's the moments when I like Pennywise. I mean, yeah, I like the giant teeth. I like when he looks like a fucking demon. But it's just better when he has to lure these children, because that's the whole concept, is he has to feed off fear and scare people and convince them to, trust him. So that's easier for him to do with children than it is with adults. So that's the creepy thing about him, is that he has to convince children that he's their friend and lure them in. So that's the heart of it. But this movie, Pennywise barely felt like he was in this goddamn thing. Maybe I just didn't see it right. Maybe it's because it was 3 hours, but I felt like Pennywise wasn't even in this movie for 10 minutes. I was sitting there the whole time like, is he going to show up again? And then they kept repeating things from the first movie. They go back to the fucking haunted house in the first movie. I knew they were going to go back to the sewers, but it's just like, they even defeated him in a very similar way. It even ended exactly the same way, which I did not like. I didn't like that we were just going through the motions of the first film at some point. The construction of this film is fucking horrible. It really is. I mean, just from a writing standpoint, which once again, if this had been a miniseries, these are things that should have been individual episodes. I would think of like Haunting of Hill House. Because let's say the first 25 minutes, this movie starts with this ridiculous opening scene where these two gay guys who are stereotypes get the shit beat out of them by other stereotypes. And then the one guy gets thrown over a bridge. And then there is a creepy scene with Pennywise that is effective that I really did like. And I was like, oh, maybe this movie will be okay. But then they do this horrible thing where Mike, who has stayed back in Derry, is calling all of the losers as adults. And it's just too much. You're like, okay, now here we are with Richie. He's a stand-up comedian. Okay, now we're with Eddie. Okay, now we're with Beverly. Okay, now we're with Bill. And it just jumps around so goddamn much. I mean, there's not, like, what I think the movie should have started is you really spent some time with Mike, and you really got to spend some time in Derry, and then he slowly starts to realize he needs to call these people, and maybe you only get to see one or two of them get called. I don't think you needed to see every single one of them get the phone call. I think that was a huge editing mistake. Just cut that shit out. It's a movie, it's not a miniseries. See, in a miniseries, you would have spent one whole episode with him getting the Losers Club back together. Or you could have done an episode just following Richie as a stand-up comic in like episode 2. Then you would do an episode where they all come meet and hang out. Then you do an episode where they figure out what they have to do and shoot and all that. And each episode would have built up to eventually them, the team getting back together, which is what this movie ultimately is at a point. It's like getting the band back together to fight this thing. But this first 25 minutes is just so sloppy. I lost interest immediately just from jumping around so much. And it's not like the dialogue or the stuff that's happening is that interesting. It's just messy. You never feel like you're getting the build up that a first act is supposed to have for a story and characterization. You don't spend enough time with each individual character to feel like you know them very well. They just want you to know, like, remember you like those kids. Here are those kids again. They're just older now. Also, I would have cut the flashbacks personally watching this. I don't dislike the flashbacks, but they did this de-aging special effect because the kids were older, because for some reason Andy Muschietti didn't shoot these sequences in the first movie. So it just looks off, and it kind of takes away from the movie. And once again, it's a pacing issue. When I was reading about it, I thought I would like the parallel stories of the kids and the adults, looking back and forth on each other. I thought it would, there's sequences in this that's sort of like that scene in Old Boy or this movie Lone Star. And I like that stuff. I like seeing the adult actor like walk through a room and then they see themselves as children. And I think it could have worked, but it just doesn't. And it adds to the length of this movie and it takes away from the adult losers clubs. I would have actually just cut all the stuff with the kids. We don't need to see them and focused on the adults. And a lot of people are like, what are you going to talk about? The kids are the best thing in the movie. Yeah, but then this kind of still feels like it's their movie, and it doesn't become the movie of these new stars. Like, James McAvoy is fucking wasted in this. Jessica Chastain is wasted in this. They're really not in it that much. So the movie does pick up, though. It does get some momentum. The Losers Club gets back together at the Chinese restaurant, and this is my favorite scene in the movie. The comic chemistry between Hader and this actor that I really didn't know, I talked about James Ranson. They're great together. They're talking about fucking each other's mothers, And the tone of this whole sequence, it's fun. It's Spielbergian. It's got a great just feel to it. It's funny. Then it gets scary and it gets weird. It goes a little over the top for my taste. And this whole movie's just filled with weird shit. Like, I don't know if Muschietti was trying to make a scary movie or a goofy movie. This reminded me of a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel. And they even have Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, playing at the theater. The first film clearly played a big homage to the original Nightmare on Elm Street. It very much was playing to Wes Craven's first film, and Pennywise was very much like Freddy Krueger, and the way the film was shot and handled, I made that comparison, a lot of people did, and New Line has a connection to this. This reminded me, this is like the 4th, 5th, 6th film in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, where Freddy is no longer scary, he's no longer this demonic presence, he has, a comedy presence, and the gore is just turned up to a level of absurdity, and it's disgusting and goofy and weird. Now, I like that in those Nightmare sequels. I'm not acting like I'm not a fan of that. I just don't think it works as well here. I don't think Pennywise is as suited for that, and I think it just clashes too much with the serious scenes in this movie. This is a film that's actually trying to have dramatic moments. and it's trying to actually say something about how the past haunts you, how you have a scar that carries with you and trauma, and you forget that trauma, you put it back, and then you have to go back and face it again, and how you have friendships that last a lifetime. It's basically like trying to be, what if the kids by Stand By Me or the Goonies had to get back together again and then deal with their past as adults and really look back on it? Great idea. Like, legitimately, great idea to have the adults really dealing with their past traumas and they haven't really recovered from it, but they've forgotten and then their memory is coming back. That's all really interesting. And that's some of the best stuff in the movie, is them remembering things and talking about it with each other, and then sort of remembering that friendship and that bond that they had. As they say in Stand By Me, I never had friends as great as I did when I was 12. But shit, does anybody? And this movie's really about that, like, rekindling your innocence, your youth, your vulnerability, losing some of your cynicism that comes with adulthood. And I think when the movie is trying to be that movie, when the Losers Club is together and they're talking about their lives, and they're trying to talk about Pennywise and they're dealing with this as adults. I mean, there's a great line Bill Hader has said, "Hey, come to Derry and fucking die, get murdered." They're acting like adults. Like, why the fuck would we stay here? I'm gonna leave. Are you fucking kidding me? We're gonna get killed by an evil demonic clown. I don't give a shit. Which is completely realistic. But then they set up this whole thing where Beverly can see into the future and she sees that all of them are going to die, like Stanley. So, by the way, spoiler, Stanley dies. The whole review is going to be filled with spoilers. But she's like, we're all going to die if we don't face it now. So at least they came up with a writing excuse. So it's like a movie that's at odds with itself, because the writing is good at this Chinese restaurant scene. And it's good, I think, whenever the losers are together as an ensemble. Where it fucks up is when they split them up Scooby-Doo style, and they all have to go get these items. They have to go get their Horcruxes, and they all go on their own separate little journey. They have a flashback. There's a horror sequence. Then they get the item. They overcome whatever Pennywise is throwing at them. And then this goes on for way too fucking long, though. Like, why not in the writing have them go together? It just doesn't make sense to me to have them all split up. Because at that point, you lose the chemistry that the actors have developed in that Chinese restaurant scene. You really lose story momentum. Like, you lose that, hey, we're going to go here, here, here. This movie should have had a quicker pacing to it. But then you get to these long, drawn-out sequences where Eddie goes to the pharmacy, or Richie sees the statue move and we get a flashback. It's not that I dislike any of these scenes. Like, I don't think they're all bad. They just, it's a construction thing. It's like the blueprint of this, which I've often said about the novel. We have to get this out of the way. It is a fucking mess of a novel. It's such a mess. And the first movie really didn't suffer from that, from the mess of Stephen King's novel. It's one of his messiest, sloppiest pieces of writing. Too many things crammed into one book, and they don't all come together well. I know it has a lot of fans who think it's a masterpiece and those things aren't issues. I don't understand that. I don't see how you can't see that the book is a fucking mess. He fits too much like stuff it's Dark Tower into this, the cosmic elements. Pennywise is more interesting without that, in my opinion. I think he's more interesting if you don't know anything about him. I think that makes him creepier. And I think really the focus of the story is the kids and then the adults dealing with trauma. But when they split them up, this is where the movie really starts to fall apart. Because, yeah, you just get these little, like, short vignettes of them all going and doing horror sequences, and none of them are that scary. None of it's that funny. There's odd decisions, once again, that feel goofy. Like, there's a scene where Eddie gets black goo spit on him, and they just out of nowhere start playing Angel of the Morning. Out of nowhere. The song has not been established in the movie. Nobody's talked about it. It doesn't make any sense. It's like a horror sequence, and then it's trying to be funny, I guess. The song comes out of nowhere. I mean, I kept trying to figure it out, like, why is he playing this song? It was in Deadpool. And there's moments like that throughout the whole movie where a moment that could be genuinely scary goes for something, like, goofy. And Bill Hader's character, Richie, at one point says, like, well, fuck me trying to add levity to this. And it was like this movie has a meta thing the whole time, and Muschietti thought that would make up for it. Like, there's the running gag that Bill is a writer now and everybody hates his endings. So they keep talking about how the ending sucks. And it's Muschietti commenting on, like, yeah, the ending to It sucks. I'm going to not pull this ending off. The ending's bad. Like, that makes up for the fact that he's making a bad ending. It's like, well, why not come up with a good ending? I don't know. And Stephen King shows up in the movie and talks about the endings being bad. It's this whole thing throughout it where they try to be self-aware, like every movie today. They try to acknowledge that it's a movie instead of actually drawing you into the film that they made, which is what the first film did very well when it works, is that it draws you into that world and like, no, this is Derry. But they also just lose a lot of things. Making it take place in the 80s and now in the 2000s, I think really hurt this because then it just felt like a lesser version of Stranger Things by the time it came out. Like the thing with Bill and his bike and Silver and all that. That makes more sense in the 50s, like a kid riding a bike and the Lone Ranger thing, hi ho Silver away. That all makes a lot of sense in the context of the 50s and then them coming back in the 80s. The problem with that first movie, a big one I had, was that it's an 80s movie, but the town of Derry felt like it was in the 50s. And there's only slight references to the 80s, like the New Kids on the Block. And then this movie, it was like, this didn't feel like a modern movie at all. This felt like a fucking 90s movie to me. I kept sitting there the whole time, like, the tone of this movie, this reminded me of, like, blockbusters from the 90s, especially when we got to the third act with the death lights and then performing Chewed and all that. That all felt like a late 90s movie to me. And even the music cues in this movie, I don't know what the fuck was going on. It wasn't really scary music. It's like I said, it's like he was going for that Spielberg thing, the way like the first film tried to be a little bit like Goonies, but I think the first film works best when it's more like Stand By Me. This had this weird like adventure movie vibe. It wasn't really a horror movie. It was like an adventure comedy. And that might be because they were adults. So they're split up and they're in these different things. There's also this stupid thing with the fucking kid. This kid shows up and says a joke to Richie's character, and Richie thinks he's Pennywise. And then it turns out he's just a fan. And then later, this kid's randomly walking by James McAvoy's character, Bill, who's like yelling at the sewers about his brother, Georgie. And the kid's like, I hear stuff too. And then he's like, oh no, hey, stay away from the voices. Run away. Leave this town. And then the kid goes to the festival in the town, like the local fair. And then Pennywise is going to attack him. And then Bill's character's like, I have to go fight this. I have to go save this kid. There's no time. And she's like, well, hey, we got Richie here and Eddie and them. Let's go get them. And we can all go together. He's like, there's no time. So he runs out. How is there no fucking time? They're all there. So Bill goes by himself to go save this kid in a funhouse, which should be one of the most effective scenes in the movie. Here's the problem. We don't know this fucking kid. He's forced in the movie. This kid's out of nowhere. When I saw the trailer, I thought that this was like Bill's son. And I go, man, this is fucked up. Pennywise is coming after the children, like their children. Or like how he goes after Bill's wife. But they cut all that stuff out. Like, where was Bill's wife? And why not have him have a son and he brings a son and he forgets that Derry's evil and then he's back and he's like, oh shit, my son's in danger. And he has to go run to the festival. Imagine how horrifying that would be if Bill was begging for Pennywise not to kill his child. Instead, it's some kid we don't know. So it's sort of creepy, but not. It's that scene in the trailer where Pennywise has the big stupid tongue out. I didn't get this. I didn't get why you just forced this kid in there to try to create. So it just takes away once again from the main cast. There is a few effective moments. The kid who was the bully, as you know in the book and in the original miniseries, he's locked up in a mental asylum, and then Pennywise helps him escape, and he's sent to go kill the Losers Club. I'd say the most effective moment of tension in this movie is when he pops up in the American Werewolf in London mirror shot behind Eddie. And he says, like, it's your time to die. And he stabs him in the fucking face. That's genuinely scary because he's real. And Eddie has to realize that he's real. And this isn't an illusion of Pennywise. And that's such an effective idea. And seeing it in like a movie like this, like actually seeing it in a big budget movie, I was like, man, that's your fucking movie. Like, what would actually scare an adult? A crazy person with a knife. But they even fuck up that. Like, there's no build up to that. We get this flashback scene with the kid, and then we come back to him in the mental asylum seeing a balloon. Then he's not in the movie for a while. Then he stabs Eddie. Then he's in the movie. He's not in it for a few minutes, and then he gets killed. So there was no build up with him to get to that moment of payoff. That's what I'm saying. This movie is sloppy. It's very poorly cut. And I don't know if it's because they cut stuff out or they filmed too much footage. I would have stripped the whole thing down. Like, Mike in the town, I would have cut the opening scene. Mike in the town, he calls let's say 2 or 3 of the main characters. Then they all meet at the Chinese restaurant. Let's say 20 minutes in. Then you spend more time on that Chinese restaurant scene. That's your meat. That's your movie. Then they all start hanging out and being like, okay, how do we defeat this thing? You go through all the arguments and so on. Then you have them go together and maybe they have to go get like 3 or 4 things and they start to figure out the ceremony of Chu and they kind of figure it out together. We learn it with them in the audience, not Mike already knowing this and then taking Bill on an acid trip. Like I said, they kept stuff from the book that just doesn't transfer cinematically. Could have worked in a miniseries, doesn't work in a 3-hour film. Then you have them, then you just have them go to the sewer and fight Pennywise, and you have like a 2-hour movie. Because really, that's all this needed to be. But all those elements that are from the book, and he still kept a lot out, but like when they introduced the death lights in this, when they show up at the end, it just feels like we didn't get enough lore at this point for it to really have impact. Like I said, Pennywise isn't in this movie for long stretches. A lot of the times he doesn't take the form of Pennywise. There's a Thing reference that's too on the nose, where Richie even says the line, "You gotta be fucking kidding me." I didn't like any of that stuff. It actually kind of pissed me off that he was so lazy with his scares and he was so lazy with his story progression that they didn't sit down and work on the plot a lot more. This movie has a really shitty plot. And its character development is kind of all over the place. Like, you sort of care by the end of the movie when all of them are hugging in the water. I like them going to swim again. I think that was very emotional, and I like them all hugging Richie. And I like Eddie dying. Because I think that guy stole the movie, and it's emotional, and I like all that. Giant spider Pennywise, I don't really know if that worked out. It was definitely better than the miniseries, but it was still like, yeah, it just makes Pennywise not feel that scary. Also, they defeat him the exact same fucking way. Like, they build up Chewed the whole goddamn movie, and then they go to do it, and it's kind of an exciting sequence, and there's this great moment with a balloon coming out of this thing, and it turns into a giant balloon, and I was like, this is cool. I could get into this. I can fuck with this. And then, they just beat Pennywise by making him feel small, and not being scared of him and beating him up, which is what the kids did in the first movie. They start telling him to fuck off, they beat the shit out of him, and he runs away. Basically, here they all yell at him, they bully him, and then they beat the shit out of him, and he dies. It's the exact same thing. I don't know why you even have Chewed in this movie. I like to call it Chud, it's a cannibalistic humanoid underground dweller. But Chewed, it doesn't work. It's like, all of that feels pointless, so why is it even in the movie? Like, if you're going to have it that they have to perform the ceremony and then make it work, that should be your climax. As Pennywise is trying to challenge them and pull them apart and scare them and be like, I think it feels scary, like when he says, keep your eyes closed. Imagine if he was like, keep your eyes closed, and Pennywise was there taking different forms of people and yelling stuff in their faces. Pennywise took the form of Stanley, and it's a psychological battle, which is really what horror should be tapping into. It's what this should be tapping into, is they have to fight the psychological war. And overcome it with Pennywise, instead of they fight a giant spider monster and then just beat the shit out of him by yelling at him. It's too goofy. It loses all, like, credibility. It's an issue with the original miniseries. It's an issue in the book, the finale, getting to the finale of it, the storm that comes into Derry, the cosmic elements. Pennywise loses a lot of his mystique. It's a flaw with all of the versions of the story, but it really doesn't. They didn't need to do that here. They could have learned from the mistakes of the past and been like, hey, we don't have to do that shit that we know it doesn't work. We can actually strip this down and focus on the bare elements that make this such a good story. Because there is a good story inside of it. And it's one of Stephen King's creepiest stories. And I think in the first movie, they captured it in a few moments. Just a few, because I don't love that movie either. I think it's overrated. But this is a much worse movie. It's a more ambitious film. It's a more epic film. I'd even say overall it's, in many ways, a technically better put together film in some ways. I think it was harder to make this movie. But it suffers from, like, sequelitis. It's like a lot of sequels. That's why it made me think of a 90s movie. It reminded me of 90s sequels where there's just something missing and they can't get the magic back. And it's sloppy to get everyone back together. This should have been the fucking Dream Warriors, man. This should have been Final Destination 2. This should have been one of the great horror sequels. They should have just expanded on the mythology had way better scares. This should be a way scarier movie than the first one. It should be way more fucked up because the first movie made $700 million. You can get away with whatever you want this time. And instead of just making it a darker, scarier film, he makes it a goofier, crazier, weirder film. It's just like weird foreign shit throughout this whole movie. It reminds me of a lot of like weird foreign horror films I've watched over the years. And that can typically work for those movies, a stylistic approach. It clashes with this being such a like Americana piece. It clashes with the filmmaker. I mean, also the screenwriter, I just don't think he did a very good job either. I don't blame them. How the fuck do you adapt this? You have to be objective and pragmatic and cut shit out. That's the only way to make this work as a movie. You're not getting the miniseries treatment here. You're not getting to tell this over 8-9 hours. So you have to cut it down and be like, okay, what do we need? People might have complained that it wasn't loyal to the book, but I think this movie would have made a lot more money and received better reviews. Because you could say that, yeah, they kept a lot of things from the book that you wanted, but that didn't make it a good movie. At that point, it's just fan service for the sake of it. There was no main character. I thought Bill and Beverly were going to step up as the leads in this movie, and that really didn't happen. It's like they split everything up a little bit too much, and I had an issue with that. Yeah, the kids were still charming. I still like those moments. But like I said, a lot of it felt like stuff that we had seen before. You know, it's weird. I remember that painting being so scary in the first one. And I remember just sequences like the projector scene, and then in this one, those same kind of special effects, those same moments, they're not as effective. Like the scene where Pennywise is in the house with them in the first one and comes in and they stab him in the head and he's going to kill them with his claw. That just has so much more atmosphere and tension in it than any moment where Pennywise is in this, because yeah, they're adults. I'm saying, like, why don't you go get a fucking gun and just shoot this motherfucker in the head? There's nothing that shows that wouldn't work, that you couldn't shoot Pennywise. They beat the shit out of him with like spikes, they hit him with chains and so on. Why can't you go get guns? These are questions that the movie never addresses that I think are reasonable. Like if I was writing this movie, I would say, okay, why don't they go buy guns, a couple guns, and then it doesn't work? Because at least there would be logic then that, like, well, hey, they tried everything. And yeah, they try to introduce the thing with the bicycle with Silver and all that, but it's forced. It's only like 1 minute of the movie. It doesn't have that emotional payoff, and it doesn't make as much sense. Because he's not a kid from the fucking fifth. Like, the reference doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? Like, the timeline, changing it to the 80s was not a good choice. Because they wanted to homage 80s movie, which Stranger Things did far better. In that first season, at least. I'm not as big of a fan of the second and third season. So just a waste of a cast, waste of particular of Bill Skarsgård and his performance as Pennywise. He should have been given a lot more to do in this. A lot of meaty dialogue, a lot of meaty sequences. Pennywise just feels like nothing in this. He feels like a fucking joke. He feels secondary. So if he's so secondary, then why not just make it about the Losers Club? But they split the fuck up. And then they keep coming up with stupid reasons for them to not be together. Like, Bill, there's no time. And then when they end up back together again, the movie picks up again in the third act. It's like whenever the full cast is together and playing off each other, and it does that Avengers thing where they have to, like, get the team together to fight the evil, the movie for the most part works. It works as, like, an entertaining blockbuster. But then the rest of the time, it completely fails as a horror movie. It's only funny in moments. I think they tried way too hard with the comedy in this. But overall, I could forgive a lot of this if it was just better put together. I just watched it the whole time thinking, this is a weird fucking movie. This is a mess. The editing is a fucking disaster. Awful editing. Just awful. Awful pacing. The movie builds up momentum, then it slows down, then it builds momentum, then it's like nonsense, then it really doesn't get a groove going for a while. It takes about 20 minutes for the movie to get in a groove. Then it loses the groove. Then it sort of gets it back again in the last like 25, 30 minutes. So I'd say it's like half of an okay movie and then half of a really, really bad movie. And I feel like that half that was really bad is pure Andy Muschietti, because I just don't think he's that good of a filmmaker. I think visually he's fine. I don't think he's a good storyteller. And I think this exposes him, thank God. And I think WB let him do way too much. I think this should have been like, hey, dude, pull back. We don't want this. There needed to be more cooks in the kitchen here, which I hate to say. This is not like, don't let the filmmaker do whatever he wants, because this was a disaster. And they lost money. They left money on the table with this goddamn movie. 100%. I really enjoyed Mike in this. I really enjoyed Richie, and I really enjoyed Eddie. And if I'd ever rewatch anything from this movie, it would be scenes with them. I didn't really like anything else about it that much. That scene in the trailer with the old lady I thought would be really creepy. It's not. I thought James McAvoy, who I adore, would be like giving this great performance and get a lot to do. He doesn't. And then by the end, you just don't care. You don't care anymore. You just kind of give up on the movie because it gave up. So overall, I have to give it Chapter 2 like a 5 out of 10, like a 5, 6 out of 10, 5.5, whatever the fuck, you know. Yeah, I wish this has been a good movie. I wish that they could have fit all that epic cosmic stuff in here and made it make sense. I wish the movie had been weird in the right ways, and I wish it also had been exciting in the right ways, but above all else, scary. Instead, it's just kind of it's a disaster from the way they constructed it. The blueprint of this movie, the scripting is where it all falls apart, and I don't think they could save it during filming. I think they thought during filming maybe they could fix it. But when you watch this movie, you really see the big issue is just not keeping your strengths together. Like that first movie, they were really smart to make it about the kids hanging out. In this movie, they spend a lot of time not having the actors hang out and having chemistry and getting along with each other, which is the key to this movie working. I think when you watch it, that's the key to it. Anyway, what did you think about It Chapter 2? Did you like it? Am I full of shit? Did you think it was brilliant? Do you like the novel, which a lot of people do? I don't understand. I like parts of it. Did you think this was as good as the miniseries? I actually like a lot of things about the miniseries a lot more than this, to be honest. I actually think they did certain things way better. And of course, how do you feel about Pennywise? And do you think there'll be some kind of It Chapter 3? And they've been talking about doing a 6-hour version of this and release it later on television. So that might save a lot of this movie and fix a lot of its issues. As of right now, though, I just have to say it. This is a very sloppy movie, and it never really built up any kind of momentum, and the buildup wasn't there for the horror scenes to work. So you're just kind of sitting there waiting for stuff to happen, and you're kind of trying to follow it, but there's just so much going on. There's so many storylines going on. There's so many plot lines. There's so many flashbacks. There's so many little things happening throughout. It's actually a pretty stuffed movie. Like, I'll say that. It's an ambitious film. There's a lot in this movie, but none of it is, like, connected well. It doesn't have coherence.